Today, I am going to talk about Chapter 8 in Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism by Chogyam Trungpa, and it is titled Sense of Humor. Well, first of all, he starts out by talking about what it isn't. It's this attitude that life is hard, that we have to be deadly serious, totally honest, and there's actually little or no humor involved when we have that kind of an attitude. And you live in basically constant pain. He makes a comparison of it's like you're a corpse, that you feel like you are being punished by all the pain and suffering that you're experiencing in your life, and that if you step out of line, it'll just get worse. And I'm going to add that you've heard me talk about the inner critic or monkey mind, and you'll have this inner critic that is constantly watching you and evaluating you and probably telling you that you're always making mistakes and screwing up and are a bad person and yada, yada, yada. So this is what he is talking about as the wrong approach. It's just much too serious. And he says the remedy is that you have to deal with life directly and honestly, properly. That you're being watched, and that in this approach, you're just watching yourself. Sometimes you're watching yourself watching yourself. He contrasts this with Big Brother, who in the novel is watching everyone. But here he says it's big me. Your ego is watching everything. And you're about to strike if you make the slightest mistake. You go through and pinpoint all your failures. You're constantly screwing up. You look like an idiot to yourself, this watcher. And that internal critic doesn't hesitate to tell you this. And so there's usually a very long list. You could say it's like your CE if you're applying for a job, your credentials of all the things that you have done, your faults, your failures, and so forth. And this is just more spiritual materialism. So this is an improper way to look at yourself. You feel like there's no room to move around, that there are no alternatives but to just engage in more of the same old, same old. He goes on and on and on about this. And it is because it can be such a problem. It's warfare with yourself. He says if you're trying to defend or attack, there is warfare. And that this is mundane, it's dualistic, and he compares it to a battlefield. He says, like in the movies, you've got people with black hats and they are the bad guys. And you've got people in white hats and they are the good guys, the old-time cowboy movies. And of course, the white hats always win. And we sometimes look at, or we can look at being a Buddhist as that kind of a situation, that we've joined this organization, we've done the right thing. A feeling of this, if I join and follow the rules, then everything is going to be okay. So he says this is a situation where we are creating a spiritual struggle or a spiritual achievement. Quote, I am speaking of seeing something more than just warfare, struggle, and duality. End quote. That this mentality is actually a sign of weakness, this battlefield warfare type of mentality. It's a sign of weakness. It's in the relative sphere, it's comparison, good, bad, eliminate, accumulate. How much have I subjected? Subjugated. How much have I subjugated? How much have I produced? Who's winning? And so forth. So he says that a sense of humor can really help with this lightening up. And that on the other hand, we can make a sense of humor solemn. We can just keep it very rigid in our humor and make humor a very serious thing. Now, this is how he defines a sense of humor: seeing both poles of a situation as they are from an aerial point of view. That's on page 113. And he talks about irony. So I looked up irony, and this is one definition: a state of affairs or an event that seems deliberately contrary to what one expects and is often amusing as a result. So this is what he is talking about, that we see the good and the bad. We see people making, and perhaps ourselves, making a big deal out of little things. And this is the irony. When you catch yourself making a big deal out of a little thing, and you can laugh a little bit, as opposed to more of the same old warfare and having the inner critic basically beat you up verbally about being an idiot. So it's good to see our faults. It's good to see this play of duality, this irony, and then just laugh at it. Some of you may have seen this post that I did on Facebook of my son and daughter-in-law, the three of us in a selfie, and we were really had big grins on our face. And it was the irony of the situation that caused that. What happened was that I was trying to take a formal picture with my cell phone camera in a tripod. And I tried like 3 or 4 times to use the timer. And each time I got a picture of my face right up close to the camera because it took the picture immediately. I couldn't get the timer to work. So finally I decided, well, I'll just take a selfie. And so I held it for a selfie and pushed the button, and the timer went off. So literally on the screen, we saw 9, 8, 7, 6, counting down the seconds. And we all just burst out laughing at the irony of this whole thing and how silly it was. So this is a good example of what he's talking here about, a sense of humor and the irony. There was a book that came out a few decades ago, and the title was Don't Sweat the Little Things. And the subtitle was It's All Little. And so there's a lot of irony in this, that we take our lives so seriously. And we don't see the irony of taking life and what happens in our lives so seriously when it's really all little. I remember having more than one interview with Rinpoche complaining about one thing or another. And his response would be, that's little, or that's minor. And in retrospect, he was right that what I was getting upset about was very, very minor. But in my mind at the time, it was a big deal. So he says that we try to build things up, create something meaningful. And then if it loses its seriousness, if we start seeing it from a different perspective, we can see through what is happening and experience the irony. One time I went out to Karmeling to have an interview with Rinpoche. This was long after the 3-year retreat. And I was invited to eat a meal with Rinpoche and some of the other Karmeling lamas and the people there. And so we sat around a table, and of course Rinpoche was at the head of the table and had a nice meal. And then afterwards, somebody went and got a large corrugated cardboard box of fortune cookies. The kind of thing that a restaurant might buy wholesale. And so the person took this big box around to everybody, and you reached in and grabbed your cookie. And I believe those fortune cookies were Buddhist fortune cookies, because my fortune was to see your drama is to be liberated from it. The point being, if we can start seeing our drama as drama, then we see the irony and it loses its force. We're liberated from it. It might be that an hour later, a new drama is unfolding, but at that point, that particular drama is over with. And so if we can have a sense of humor and see the irony, see at these two poles, two opposites that are interacting at this time, it can really help us lighten up and let go. Now, where is the sense of humor coming from? Where is the source of this sense of humor? And he says it comes from all-pervading joy, that it comes from our ultimate nature. So with this sense of humor and letting go, that there's room to expand, that the situation becomes completely open, that there is no battle between this and that, self and other. He says there's no hint of limitation. You don't have limits placed on yourself and the situation that you would get if you were solemn, if you were deadly serious, and so forth. So treating life like a big deal, it imposes your idea on what is supposed to be. It's serious business. And Trungpa Rinpoche says, that is funny. He says it's also funny when you try to make everything funny, because then the funny becomes serious, like he was talking at the beginning. And he also says it's funny to see others engage in these same types of ego games. And even looking at other people and seeing their funny behavior, taking life so seriously, that even that is another game. Then he goes into a couple of stories. And the first story is about the monk who was meditating, and that his whole life he's always been meditating on suffering. And so he is a very serious person. He was reputed to be just never smiling, just always very, very serious. And one day, a donor, when he was out of where he practiced, put a large piece of turquoise on the shrine. So he comes back and sees this large piece of turquoise on his shrine, and he starts practicing. And all of a sudden, a mouse comes out and tries to pull the turquoise away. The mouse became attached to it. And that alone is funny, because what's a mouse going to do with it? Can't eat it, can't make a nest out of it. So then the mouse brought a second mouse out to help him, and the two mice couldn't move it. And so eventually they brought out 8 more, a total of 10 mice. And I don't know how 10 mice can all work together on this piece of turquoise, but anyway, that's the way the story went. And he watched them drag it into their hole and disappear. And of course, this caused the monk to laugh. How ridiculous this was. And Trungpa Rinpoche said, quote, "It was his first introduction to openness, a sudden flash of enlightenment." So now he uses the word here, flash. So it's just a flash, but it's still an experience. And that's a very important point. So a sense of humor sees the extremes, sees how these extremes are related, and then doesn't take them seriously. He says this helps you avoid hope and fear. He talked about hope and fear a lot. The idea is that they go together. And again, it's very dualistic, that if you're hoping something happens, then you're afraid it won't. And If you're afraid that something happens, you hope something happens and you hope that it won't happen or something else will happen. So if you have hope, you're going to have fear. And if you have fear, you're going to have hope. And if we don't take things so seriously, that can really help tamp down this battle between hope and fear. There is a street in Eau Claire called maybe Fear Avenue. And way back, I knew, well, even now, I know a woman named Hope. And my personal joke was that it seems like Hope should live on Fear Avenue. But that's just my personal little joke. So anyway, the experience of the spiritual path is very significant. Yet, he says, meditation is insignificant because you don't place any value on it. There's no judgment on the meditation experience. You just meditate, and the best that you can, let go of judging. Just do it. And when you meditate that way, this leads to openness. And with that openness, you start seeing all the games going on inside of you. And again, if there is no value judgment on what you see, but just see, that is the best way. Usually when we start seeing these games that are going on inside of our minds, we start judging ourselves. Oh, I'm a bad person. Oh, there I go again. Yada, yada, yada. If we just go that way, being very judgmental, it's just the same old, same old. Whereas if we can just kind of see it and let go of it, then we are going somewhere. So he finishes up this chapter with, he compares this openness that a person can have with no value judgments. He compares it with a very solemn and serious person who makes a big deal of it. And the quote that is at the end of this chapter is, when you work in accordance with the basic insignificance of what is, then you begin to see the human of this kind of solemnity in people, making it, see the humor. My spell check, I'm going to start over with this. My spell check here, it was not working very well. So here, let's go over this again. When you work in accordance with the basic insignificance of what is, then you begin to see the humor of this kind of solemnity in people making such a big deal out of things. And that's how he ends this chapter. Now comes the questions and answers. To kind of sum up the first question, what about the argument, be good, give up evil? And Rinpoche's answer is that from the point of view of sense of humor, and this is an important point, is this is the point of view from sense of humor. You're not giving up, but you're taking on. And that the irony is the more you give up, the heavier the load. That you keep on thinking about giving up. And you might even talk to other people about how much you have given up. And it's just more ego. By this kind of approach, meditation gets very serious. You get into the watcher, deciding whether you are a good meditator or a bad meditator. Is this meditation session better than the last one? You compare yourselves with other people. Did I give up as much as this other person did? Or I gave up more than the other person did? And so forth. He compares it to eating a heavy meal and then regretting eating it because you feel stuffed, you feel heavy, you're uncomfortable. And you wish that you could be hungry again. So his advice is don't take spirituality so seriously. That this kind of giving up is just counter to the true meaning of giving up. The next question is, has an enlightened being overcome a sense of tragedy? And he says you don't need to be enlightened to give up tragedy. And now here he is talking in terms of giving up. I want to point that out. So he says you might see the humor in crescendo situations where it builds, it builds, it builds, and then suddenly it stops, referring to music. And you see the silence as part of the music. About this crescendo, there is space, there's silence after a gap, you might say. When our ordinary life has these emotional crescendos in it that we usually don't see it, and we just keep going on, and then we have the next crescendo. But if we do see it, it is actually a very ordinary, insignificant experience because there's no value judgment. It's a gap. He says the experience is hardly there even. But if we bring our ego back into it, its insignificance becomes very significant. And then you're back to a big deal. But again, as we go through our daily lives, there's always gaps. The gap between the end of one thing and the beginning of another. And if we can kind of take a step back and just watch rather than getting involved, we start seeing this. And it's actually quite liberating to see it, watch it happen, but not buy into it. So the third question is a sense of humor related to the experience of instant enlightenment? Satori. And he says, certainly. And then he tells this story about the man who practiced Amitabha. And he thought that Amitabha was gray. He misunderstood his Lama's instructions. And so he did this for many years, and now he's on his deathbed. And there's a Lama in the room, and he asks the Lama for some instructions about Amitabha. And the Lama says, well, first of all, Amitabha is red. And the man started seeing that he had been visualizing Amitabha as gray, saw the irony in all of this. He burst out laughing and he died laughing. So this is what I find interesting about a lot of Tibetan stories, is the ending isn't what we in the West are used to, which is that they lived happily ever after. He laughed so hard that he was cured and so forth. But no, he died laughing, and not too bad way to die. So Trungpa Rinpoche goes on by saying that there are lots of stories of people that they see this flash of the enlightened state and they break out laughing. That they see the irony of these polar situations, good and bad, white, black, night, dark, and so forth. Then the other story is about this man that was practicing, and he had a donor in the area that would provide food and basic necessities. And usually the donor's wife or a child would come with these things, but he knew that the next time it would be the donor himself. And so he prepared to have the donor enter and see his room that he was practicing in. And so he cleaned everything up, polished the bowls, had it looking much nicer than it would ordinarily. And then he realized that he was being hypocritical. So he threw ashes all over everything and put things in disarray, perhaps messier than even normal for him. So the donor comes now and sees, I think the word was the natural quality of the room, and praised the yogi. And of course, at that point, the yogi just burst out into laughter, seeing the irony, and he told the donor what he had done, and that he had first cleaned it up and then he made a mess of it purposely. And the donor burst out in laughter too. And Trungpa Rinpoche says, quote, "It was a great moment of awakening for both of them." The fourth question is, do you ever mean to imply there is a way out? And the response is, if we seek a way out, it is a fantasy. The dream of enlightenment, the dream of salvation, of escape, that we need to be practical. We need to examine our neurotic mind. Trungpa Rinpoche would use neurosis a lot, referring to confused mind. So with, quote, complete familiarity, end quote, with our neurotic mind, we know the way out automatically. If we attach to it, if we think about it, how beautiful it was, how beautiful it will be, and so on and so forth, then it becomes an obstacle. He says, he compares this with going to the doctor. You go to the doctor and you tell him what's wrong with you, not what's right with you. That's the way you get cured of your illness. If the doctor doesn't know what's wrong with you, if you don't know what's wrong with you, there's no way out. So we have to admit it to ourselves. And he says that the Four Noble Truths, the first one is the truth of suffering rather than the beauty of enlightenment. And the final question is, are the errors and obstacles you talk about in your recent lectures more advanced than those mentioned at the beginning of the book? And he says, true, that as we awaken, there is the tendency to analyze the awakened state, to look at oneself, evaluating, analyzing. And this continues until we reach the last meditative state, the Vajra-like samadhi or meditation. And that meditative state doesn't stand for any nonsense, that it cuts through all of our games. It sees it very clearly and is unmoved and does not buy into, you might say, the ego games and the nonsense. So he talks about the Buddha's enlightenment and the Maras. And the first time that Mara appeared, it was as an army of demons that were threatening him with death. And then he says the last one was the seduction by the daughters of Mara, and that is thinking that I have achieved something, that is, you might say, the final obstacle that has to be overcome, that I have achieved something, because there's no I to achieve anything at that point.